Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the No Fun League. Today, I'm joined by Arif Hasan. He has a Substack. He has previously worked for The Athletic and other publications. And last week, he wrote an article which kind of took off. Ian Rappaport retweeted it. Sam Monson from PFF retweeted it. And that's what led me to check it out. I subscribed right away. I never subscribed to articles behind a paywall just to read one of them. I think the last time I did it was 2020 when the Washington Post had the article about Dan Snyder right before the football season started. But I was like, I have to keep reading. And yeah, he was gracious enough to hop on to talk about the article and just doing some research. I have a bunch of other questions for him if, once we get into it. But thank you for joining me, of
Yeah, man, no worries. Yeah, thanks for inviting me on.
course. But to give everybody some background on this article, it was about the Draft Network, a website which really took off the last 5 years or so, I'd say. And I remember when I first got into like very interested into the draft, like that's what I used to make my mock drafts. And I'd print them out or I just like rewrite it on paper to have it. But their draft machine, their mock draft machine was like one of the first like very, very good ones before PFF and everything. And then just from personal experience, because I was subscribed, I remember like when that got taken down and they had like a new one, which was mostly through Discord, but it was very buggy. And I was like, oh, well, this isn't that great anymore. So then I stopped that and went on to PFF, which is, I think, taken the mantle from them for most people. But so the article itself was phenomenally written. And I think my first question is like, what motivated you to write this?
I was kind of surprised that I was even kind of entering this territory. So I don't typically do a lot of investigative journalism. I'm more of a kind of a data and analysis breakdown guy. I like to focus on analytics. I like to focus on film review to kind of learn as much as we can about football. And like you, I had been very kind of captured by the Draft Network's entire like product lineup. I thought that their analysis was really good. I ended up becoming friends with some of the people that wrote there. I thought that the mock draft machine was excellent, and in fact, I actually wrote a story 2 years ago or 3 years ago. I wrote the story 3 years ago, published 2 years ago because of a weird timing thing about the growth of mock draft simulators, where I
Hmm.
talked about the mock draft machine over at the Draft Network, but also the PFF one, the one that's over at Fanspeak right now. And I talked to a couple of them about how it came to be because I think it's a really critical part of how fans engage with the draft. So it's something that I was always kind of entertained by and always been kind of present with. And at the time, actually people would send me their mocks from these mock draft machines all
Hmm.
the time. It like dominated my mentions. And it was fun because like, these are like fun ways to engage with the draft, and you end up learning a lot about these players and how the draft works, which is great. But in November, December, the Draft Network went offline completely, and I actually
Hmm.
hadn't checked a bunch of their work recently, which maybe that's another sign, right? But I was like, hey, what's going on? Because they're like promoting these articles, and you click on the tweet, and there's no website. Like that's so bizarre. And I thought like, man, the website is down, right? It's just like it'll be up tomorrow or something. And then I noticed in the replies that people are saying this website's been down for weeks. I'm like, oh my gosh, that's wild. Why are you still promoting these articles? And
Hmm.
I think there's even a tweet where I'm like responding to one of the mock drafts where I'm just like, why are you like paying someone to produce graphics for a website nobody can visit? This is like such bizarre behavior.
Hmm.
Um, but then and I like DM'd a couple of people. I'm like, this is like kind of odd, right? And then in January, I think January 4th or something like that, early January, they tweet out we're back, right? And they've got the statement about how, the website had been taken hostage and okay. And I thought that was really unusual. Like I've never heard that language before from a company that they were held hostage. So I quote tweeted, I was like, this is like bizarre. What's going on here? And someone direct messaged me and they were like, hey, do you know about the lawsuit? I'm like, what? What do you mean do I know about the lawsuit? No, I don't know about a lawsuit. Tell me more. And so they like told me about this lawsuit, which is in the piece. It's ArcTouch versus the Draft Network. And I read through it and I was like, this is like a lot going on here. what's the deal? And so I like reached out to people who had like worked for the Draft Network and who had been like kind of a big part of its rise and its success. And I was like, hey, what's the deal? Is everything all
Hmm.
right? What's going on? I know you don't work there anymore, but like, are you familiar? And over time, I kind of learned more about the story. And then someone was like, hey, Arif, you should write about this. I'm like,
Hmm.
"Oof, I don't know. That's weird to write about." And they're like, well, no, here's the thing, Arif. Like, we can't say it ourselves, right? Because, we're worried about, as you'll notice in the piece, everybody's anonymous, right? They're worried about blowback or not even necessarily from the draft network, but there's like, as within any industry, if you have like a reputation as like a whistleblower,
Hmm.
it becomes more difficult to
Hmm.
to get employment going forward. And so there's like a lot of reasons that they didn't want to speak out. And I really wanted to respect that. And I was like, okay, well, you can't, but like you should probably talk to some people who are like really good investigative journalists that cover the media, like people like Will Leitch or Bill Shea or AJ Perez over at Front Office
Hmm.
Sports. Like, you should talk to people that are very familiar. When it's like, well, Arif, I know you and I've already told you like a lot of this.
Hmm.
You should just do it. I'm like, okay, fine. So I get around to doing it, and I've not done investigative pieces before, but like I have been around the block. I know how to do journalism, so
Hmm.
I needed to make sure that when I talk to people, that when I approach them, I was like, hey, I can't tell you who I've talked to, but I've talked to a bunch of people over at the Draft Network, and I wanted to talk to you about what's been going on here. Here are the kind of the things that I know, and I want to know if you can corroborate them or if you have any new information. And they're like, okay, well, like, kind of what's the deal here? Can I be anonymously quoted? Can I be on the record, off the record? What's it? And so with everybody I talked to, I was like, well, here are the things I can do for you. I can make you anonymous. I do like to quote as much stuff as possible. If those quotes are distinct, right, I'll run them by you to see if, that the quote itself would de-anonymize you.
Hmm.
And if you give me any stories, and those stories are interesting enough to run in print, then I'll run those stories by you to see
Hmm.
if that de-anonymizes you. And they're like, okay. So I ended up talking to a dozen people this way. And they're like, you should talk to such and such. They're a vendor that worked with them. They didn't get paid. You should talk to so and so. They
Hmm.
secured an advertising deal. They didn't get paid. Or they secured an advertising deal and they paid the draft network and they didn't get what they paid for. You should talk to those people. So I ended up over 3 months, ended up talking to a bunch of different people. It's like 20 hours of phone conversations. I ended up going through all the legal documents and yeah, I mean it was like a process where I was kind of resistant to writing the story, but the people that I talked to,
Hmm.
they said that they trusted me and they said that they thought that I could do a good job with the story and that they wouldn't be able to do it themselves, and
Hmm.
they didn't know if they were comfortable talking to people that they didn't know, people
Yeah.
like Perez. And so
Hmm.
who again I think does really excellent work at Front Office Sports, but sometimes it's people right?
Hmm.
And so that's kind of what pushed me to write the story because most of the time again I don't really tend to do this kind of stuff. So
Yeah.
it was really unusual direction to go in.
Hmm. And like I said, I subscribed right away, and then I was like, okay, and then I knew that you and I would be speaking, recording this, since I was like, okay, now time to read a lot more of your work. And I noticed that the very first piece was like, I don't remember the exact title, but it's basically if you're new here,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
So
yeah.
I think that touches into my next question is, what has the reaction been like for you? Has like I know, like I said, like Ian Rappaport is tweeting like he's followed by like so many football fans and people in general, alongside some of the other people you're getting new subscribers. Has there been any negative feedback as well, after
Uh,
publishing that story?
Surprisingly little. Most of the time when I publish something, I get some negative feedback, and the bigger the piece is, the the I get the same proportion, right? So proportionally similar negative feedback. So I'll get a bunch of feedback, and some 10, 15, 20% of it, somewhere in there, is negative in some
Hmm.
capacity. And so when a piece gets really big, 20% of that is negative, and that's like a lot. In this case, that wasn't really what happened,
Hmm.
which I found really surprising because I know that there's been a lot of criticism of the use of anonymous sources in journalism. And I think a lot of that just has to do with, people kind of not understanding how a lot of the journalistic process needs to work out.
Hmm.
And I understand the skepticism, especially because there's been a lot of controversy recently about the use of anonymous sources
Hmm.
that have borne out turned out to be correct skepticism, right? It turned out to be, some problems. So there have been controversies in journalism about this practice, but you don't get subjects to talk to you without promising anonymity, and then you have to fulfill your obligation to those
Mm-hmm.
subjects, right? And so I was concerned that like I don't really name anyone in the story as a source, and so I was like really worried that people were gonna come at me about that. And so I needed to do as much as I could to corroborate stuff independently and show my work and stuff like that. And I guess whatever I was doing on that end, ended up satisfying people to whatever degree.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Plus, what I said was like very specific, and so had I been wrong about some of the very specific things that I had said, I would have received pushback probably from the draft network.
Mm-hmm.
And so I know that there was like something there, but no, I didn't get very much negative feedback at all. Again, super surprising because I
Mm-hmm.
usually get just a fair amount because it's football.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
people love football and
Mm-hmm.
they love to hate the stuff they don't like.
Exactly.
And so yeah, I didn't get a ton. I did get a couple of people that were upset that the story was behind a paywall, and I do understand that. I understand not liking the paywall. That to me is I'm totally
Mm-hmm.
empathetic to that. I think feeling like you have a right to a story that's beyond a paywall is kind of a bridge too far for me, and that's when
Mm-hmm.
I started pushing back against people. But that was not actually a ton of people, right? It's a
Mm-hmm.
12,000 word piece.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people were like, well, if I'm going to pay for any story, I guess it'll be this one. It's like,
Exactly.
okay, yeah. So I fulfilled the value obligation that I have to a lot of people
Mm-hmm.
in that sense. And so even that practice that a lot of people don't like, I didn't get a ton of negative feedback. So
Mm-hmm.
I didn't even get a ton of feedback on the use of anonymous sources. I got a little bit of negative feedback on like, hey, this looks like a hit piece, and it's like I know it does, but this is kind of the path that was laid out
Mm-hmm.
ahead of me. It wasn't like I was trying to engineer a campaign against somebody. It was just like all
Yeah.
of the pieces were pointing in the same direction. So yeah, it was interesting because
Mm-hmm.
I've had pieces get pretty big before, probably not as big as that one.
Mm-hmm.
But I've had pieces get really big before,
Mm-hmm.
and I get a proportional amount of negative feedback, and I just deal with it. But this
Yeah.
time it was pretty positive. I was
Mm-hmm.
pretty surprised.
I think that speaks to the quality of journalism that was there. And like it's a compelling story. I remember it was Wednesday, so the play-in games were happening for March Madness. And I had a game on and I completely forgot about the game that was on until my friend started texting me about it because it got close. Because I was like fully transfixed reading the article like on my phone. I remember like scrambling to find my card somewhere so I could put in everything to get behind the paywall. Which as you were saying that, I was like, this is how Giants fans felt when Saquon went to the Eagles. It's like we're happy that he got his money, but we're just mad at the way he went about it. And it felt like I fully understand like this is an income generator for you and like you spent 3 months on the piece, so should put it behind the paywall. Does it annoy me sometimes when articles are behind a paywall? 100%, but like if I was doing it, I would do the exact same thing. So I can't criticize anybody for doing it. But I think that's very cool because it's very rare that like anything right now, especially on Twitter or X, is um is like positive feedback for like even like
Yeah. Well, yeah,
75% of the comments. Like it's very rare.
yeah, I mean, Twitter's a negative feedback machine. It
Hmm.
rewards negative engagement. So, no, I totally agree that it was kind of an unusual situation where the vast majority of the feedback on something that spread pretty far and wide was negative. And I still think people wanted to engage with the piece negatively, but they didn't engage with me negatively. They
Hmm.
engaged with other people negatively. So the subject of the piece is, the CEO of the Draft Network, Paige DeMacos. And I really don't want her to get harassed or anything like that. In fact, I shared a couple of texts with a bunch of friends. I'm like, hey, I'm kind of really worried this piece is going to get published.
Hmm.
And if the piece is successful, she's going to look really bad at the end
Hmm.
of the piece. And she hasn't tweeted in a couple of days. If you go through her Twitter mentions, they're really bad. And I actually feel genuinely bad
Hmm.
about that. Um, and people are going like really far to do that kind of thing, and I think that that's
Hmm.
pretty unfair. But I think that that's what ended up happening is that people do like to engage with stuff negatively, especially on Twitter. Again,
Hmm.
there's like It like sits in our brain
Yeah.
after being in Twitter for so long. It sits
Hmm.
in our brain that this is how we engage with content.
Exactly.
And I think they directed that at her instead of me,
Hmm.
which is unusual, again, just from my experience. But, I will say this. I mean, Paige is a woman in sports. It's really difficult.
Hmm.
And so she having something negative written about her um, then kind of magnifies that experience for her. She tweeted out a video of Caleb Williams at his pro day. He's just walking. It's a
Hmm.
pretty benign video. The video
Yeah.
actually did fairly well. But a lot of her replies are about this piece, and I'm like fine with people saying like, "Hey, do you have a response to this piece?" And maybe 80 people saying it is too
Hmm.
much, but people like telling her what she should do, right?
Yeah.
Which I don't want to get into detail of what that
Yeah.
means, but like that's way too, oh my
Oh,
God, I don't
for
want that
sure.
at all.
Hmm.
Um, so I think that's what ended up happening is that the negative feedback went in a different direction, and I just happened to avoid it in this case. But I
Hmm.
agree that Twitter rewards, encourages, and then accultures us to
Hmm.
producing a negative response to a lot of things. So yeah.
I I just learned a new word. Thank you. Um, no, I fully understand. Like half of what I do on Twitter is try to troll people just for like I'll go on Marjorie Taylor Greene's account or some other random and just start trolling, like replying to everything
Mhm.
with the clown emoji if I want. And it's so funny seeing people read like actual like the bots and like actual people get so triggered by that. Genuinely hilarious. But I think that is a really important point that you touched on that like I've been like checking for that too. Like I know that she has like her likes hidden on her profile, but I think with an article like this, as I wouldn't say like you intended it to be a hit piece or accusatory, but it is because those are the facts of the situation. And like some people will definitely take it too far. I think it's like you said, it's fair for a few people, not 80, to ask if there's a response to the story. And I know that you mentioned in the article that there were several requests for a comment from her. But after the story has been published, has there been anything from like a friend or like a friend of a friend or like a mutual person in between you guys, like letting you know like what her thoughts or opinions were, or has it kind of just been like radio silence on what?
Yeah, I haven't heard from any mutual friends. We have a couple. I haven't heard from any mutual friends about kind of what um her response has been, how she's taking it, all of that. I haven't heard anything along those lines. The closest is that there's a couple of people who read the piece that are also in their official Discord, that have seen some responses from Jamie Eisner, who basically just says we didn't want to be quoted in the article. We felt there was no reason to have a response to this piece. We're just kind of let it lie. And then a couple of people asked follow-up questions like, "Hey, is this thing about the house in Las Vegas true?
Hmm.
Is this thing true about paying people?" And he responded to a couple before he kind of just shut it down. He's like, "I don't really want to." Engage in this back and forth because,
Hmm.
I'm not putting out an official statement or anything like that. And
Exactly.
basically, he just said, the statements about the Las Vegas house are true, but they were like salaciously written. It wasn't as bad as it sounds. It's a bit of a nothing burger, I think, is the phrase that he used. And I'll give him this. The stuff about the Las Vegas house is so compelling, but in terms of how they operate as a company, in
Hmm.
terms of like the ethical standards and practices operating as a media company, it is relatively small. It is a big mistake that ended up having even bigger outcomes than
Hmm.
one could have imagined. But it is like a booking mistake, right?
Hmm.
It's just crazy that it happened.
Yeah.
Um, so I'll give him that hey, this is bigger than it is. But at the same time, it's like really hard to downplay. I don't know what I'm allowed to say on this podcast in terms of like
Oh,
um it's hard to
no.
downplay there's like bags of cocaine in the house, right?
Yeah.
That's just
Oh,
like a
for
difficult thing to get around, right?
100%. I think we've all had experiences booking a hotel or Airbnb where it's not what it seemed like when we were booking it.
Yeah,
But at that level, at that big a moment when you have draft prospects and other people coming
right.
in, is, and like you said, it's compelling. Like it's one of the big like attention grabbers when you're looking at the link on Twitter to make you
Yeah.
go read it. So you definitely should include it and it should be headline news. But like if you look at the title of your article and the description beneath it on your website, there's obviously no mention about it because as you said, it's a very small thing compared to the entire like business practices
Right.
and everything like that. Um, hang on, like on your end, when you're writing the story, are there any like legal things that you have to make sure that you take care of and are mindful of while you're writing it and before you publish it?
Yeah, I mean, so the primary concern here is whether or not I could be hit with a defamation lawsuit or anything along those lines. And so, um, luckily in the United States, the truth is an absolute defense against defamation, right? So there's even if I didn't know what I published to be true, if I thought it might be true and I published it and it turns out to be true, I'm in the clear. So
Hmm.
that's just the case at a ground level. But beyond that, if there's a good faith belief that a reasonable person who looked at the same data that I looked at believed that what I wrote was true based off of the information I received, that it would not constitute defamation because there has to be proof of malice and something intent, right? Like I don't know
Hmm.
the exact legal language. Um, and that was something I was mindful of. I was as I was constructing this piece, and I was like, well, okay, so if I'm writing this sentence looks pretty bad for the draft network or for the CEO or whatever,
Hmm.
right? How would I go about defending this sentence in court? And it's like, okay, well, I recorded my phone calls. So I've got these
Hmm.
recordings of phone calls that tell me this. And I think if two people tell you something independently, that's a pretty reasonable belief that that is the case. And so I've got a bunch of recordings and data and evidence to back me up in the case that there ends up being something like a cease and desist or even a defamation lawsuit. Um, I'm also somewhat confident in that any defamation lawsuit would require them to go into discovery, which I think is not something that they want to do because it would expose, their bank accounts and all that. And I think
Hmm.
that would be a pretty difficult situation for them. I also figured that because they didn't hire a lawyer to protect themselves from a $400,000 lawsuit, that they probably weren't going to be proactive to hire a lawyer and go against me. And that was like the last level consideration. Like the
Hmm.
first thing I want to do is I want to be right, and then I want to be
Exactly.
defensively right. And then I can like worry like, oh, there's probably not going to be a chilling effect. They're probably not going to threaten me. It's like the last level there. But it is, something I was like, I'm probably fine. That said, I still talked to a couple of lawyers informally. I didn't consult them, so I didn't
Hmm.
pay them an hourly consultation rate or anything like that. But I was like, hey, here's kind of, my concern of what I'm thinking and how familiar are you with like defamation law and stuff like that. And they were like, well, here's kind of, without like doing research for you, because then I'd have to charge you. Here's kind of what my thoughts are. And I was like, okay. So I use that as a guidance to help write the piece.
Hmm.
There's actually a lot of stuff that I didn't put in the story because, in a hypothetical lawsuit, if I had to defend myself on the stand, I
Hmm.
think I would not have the best defense. So I didn't put it in the story. So only the stuff that I felt like I could reliably confirm ends up in the story, and that turns out to be, a really strong legal defense.
Hmm. And it's still like there's still so many details, like you said, it's 12,000 words. Like it's still like enough to be very compelling and engaging. Like I think in this day and age, like all of us have a little bit of TikTok brain in us.
Yeah.
It's hard to pay attention to one thing and like at one time. But I never was I like did I like I said I didn't like look up. Like I had a basketball game on literally 5 inches away from my face and I didn't look at it while I was reading it. Because it's just like
There's a huge comment, by the way. I just got a comment on the story like an hour before we
hmm.
recorded, and it was like basically the same thing. It's like, hey, I got the story, and I began to read it so that I could read it in between sets while I was working out because I was at the gym, and I just never got to my workout. And I was like, that is an enormous compliment.
Yeah.
That rule. I mean, like you should work out, but that
Hmm.
rules. I'm so
No,
happy
it's
that
yeah.
because I don't consider like writing to be actually like in terms of good prose, I don't actually consider that one of my strengths. It's one of the
Hmm.
concerns that I have as a writer because again, I primarily focus on like film review and data
Hmm.
analysis and stuff like that. That's like my beat.
Hmm.
And so and I do deep research is like which is like where the Aaron Rodgers piece comes from. Is like I do a lot of research into stuff. Like that's my strength.
Hmm.
And so the primary concern I had publishing this piece was that it would be compelling enough to read through. And actually, the first draft I gave someone, they were like, "Well, I was reading through it and I loved it. I couldn't put it down, but
Hmm.
my girlfriend was next to me, and she got bored really quickly."
Hmm.
And I think the reason I liked it is because I know all the people that you're talking about. I know what the
Yeah.
draft network is. I'm into the industry, so there's got to be a way that you can maintain people's attention throughout the piece. And I was like, okay, well, that's going to be my primary challenge. So
Hmm.
I tried to figure out ways to get people hooked and reading more without being cheap and without um lying and without
Hmm.
without selling a bill of goods that
Yeah.
wouldn't pay itself off. So
Hmm.
I throw in bits of foreshadowing throughout the piece. Like there's a line like this isn't the last time the founders would be asked to give up
Hmm.
revenue, right? And it's like, oh,
Yeah.
okay, well that's a little bit of a hook.
Exactly.
Yeah, and those are small ones, and then there's large ones like the pull quotes throughout the piece. That was a decision I made pretty early on to see if I could get people interested in the piece. The very first one compares the CEO to Elizabeth Holmes from Theranos, and I
Hmm.
thought, hey, if that's like one of the first things people read, they'll probably want to keep reading the story,
Exactly.
right? And so I put those pull quotes in throughout the piece, and then and so I was like, okay, well, this is like pretty good. What can I do to kind of make it so that people are like, oh, I just get to the good stuff, right? Like,
Hmm.
because like to me it was important to set up the history of like draft Twitter and the
Hmm.
founding of the draft network so that I could get into it. So like, because if I just like, hey, here's a thing the CEO did, I think a lot of people would be like, why is she the CEO? What's going
Yeah.
on here? And so I went back and then I went back and went back, and now I
Hmm.
end up having a history piece in addition to a piece of investigative journalism.
Exactly.
And then now I'm worried that like people will like, I don't really care about draft Twitter. Get
Hmm.
to the porn house. You talked about a porn house. Get me to the porn house. So then I was like, okay, well, I'll put in underneath the pull quote, I'll put in a 2 paragraph teaser about everything that I learned and about how bizarre it was to report on this piece. And it turns out after I didn't receive a comment from the draft network, that was actually a really good place to put the I reached out for comment and didn't receive
Hmm.
comment paragraph. And
Exactly.
then I put a table of contents in there. What's really interesting is that at the time I didn't think Substack allowed you to link headers. Like I'm pretty
Hmm.
used to WordPress, and in WordPress it's very easy to set up a table of contents where you can link to different parts of the story and different headers. And I didn't think Substack had it. And then and one of my friends had recommended doing that. Um and I was like, okay, I don't think I can do that. And I found out I could, but the problem is
Hmm.
I couldn't test it. So actually, when the piece goes live, is the first time I'm ever using a linkable table of contents, and the first time I see whether or not it works. It does, which is great, but then I had to come up with the chapter titles for the linkable headers, and I knew that the chapter titles and the heading titles would have to be a little bit different because the heading titles work with the flow of the story,
Hmm.
whereas the linkable table of contents, the chapter titles, needed to encourage people that there were things that they would want to know about so that they could click through, which is why like one of the chapter titles is the racist tweets. Well, everyone loves a good canceling. So that's the
Hmm.
chapter title. But the piece, the header of that part of the piece is the draft network encounters new obstacles or something along those
Hmm.
lines, and which is in line with the flow of the story, but is not the way that people would want to go about and click on the tweet, right, or
Hmm.
click on the thing. So I had to balance that out, and I wanted to make sure that when I did it, that I wouldn't be accused of clickbait, essentially. Like I
Hmm.
want people to click on the story, but the problem with clickbait is that it doesn't deliver. That's the thing. So I wanted to deliver. And so that was the
Hmm.
balance that I had to build. And I'm really glad that a lot of people found it really compelling because it is not a type of writing that I find myself to be a strength of mine. So
Hmm.
I'm glad.
I think you're selling yourself short a little bit. I think it was, like I said, it's truly phenomenal. But I think my last question involving this story in particular, and it might be the porn house, but what was like like the little tidbit of information that is in the story that gave you like the biggest wow moment while you were investigating this piece?
It's the bags of cocaine. Uh, it like it's hard to get past that. The thing is, that wasn't in the first 2 drafts of the story because I didn't know about it. Um, so what ended up happening in that situation was I am running, like I'm doing the final, like I'd already sent an email to the draft network. I'd already sent emails to um Paige and also Don Hudson, who's the owner of Fourth and One that owns either a majority share or outright owns the draft network. I'd already sent all of those confirmation emails, right?
Mm-hmm.
And all I was doing is I was running quotes by sources to see if they stood by those quotes, if that was an accurate recollection, and if they were worried it was going to de-anonymize them to use that quote. I was fact checking because there are parts of the story where I'm like, where, for example, like in the December 2022 town hall, at one point, one of the founders says, how can I send my guys to the Senior Bowl if they're not getting
Mm-hmm.
paid or something along those lines?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the guy isn't the one who told me that. Someone else in the meeting told me that. So I had to run it by someone else in the meeting to see, hey, do you recall this happening? And so, stuff like that, where I'm just like, hey, this thing about the point. So I'm running details against other people to see
Mm-hmm.
if they can confirm those details. And someone goes, yeah, man, that takes me back. That's crazy. I mean, that and the bags of cocaine and the stripper pole. And I'm like, what? Excuse me? This is the night before publishing, but
Wow.
like it is like the 11th hour.
Wow.
Actually, it might have literally been 11 p.m. Central when I'm like, excuse, you didn't tell me about the bags of cocaine. Tell me more about what is going on. So he tells me the story about the cocaine, and I'm like, okay, well, that's what I can't run that, but now I can't let it go. So I'm like frantically, and I'm like, these people are all asleep. This is not going to work. I'm like frantically texting other people. I'm like, hey, and this is like such a weird text to send. It's like, hey, is there a story about cocaine you forgot to tell me? Is like, right? Because I don't want to give them the details and for them to be like,
Mm-hmm.
yes. I want them to tell me the story and see if it lines up with the other story. And
Mm-hmm.
I ended up getting like 3 or 4 responses, and they're like, "Oh, yeah, I totally forgot." I'm like, "How did you forget?" That is the thing I would remember. But like, okay, fine. You were overwhelmed at the time. I understand. Um, so there was that, and then the chairs in the conference room. Um, that was the exact same. Like, this takes me back to the bags of cocaine,
Mm-hmm.
and also, the chairs didn't arrive. And at first, I was like, chairs, whatever. I don't really care. There's like a bunch of organizational mishap happening in this part of the story. I don't really need to talk about the fact that the chairs didn't arrive. But I was like, I'll follow up. I'm like, well, what do you mean like the chairs didn't arrive? It's like, well, the house doesn't have any office chairs, and we're supposed to do like a conference room style setup. So we have to order these office chairs, and they don't arrive until the day of the draft. I'm like, oh, I might include that detail. That's kind of interesting. So it's like, yeah, so we had to put together these office chairs, and there wasn't any room for them. And I was like, what do you mean room? I mean, I saw the live show. There's room
Mm-hmm.
for a table and office chairs. They're like, no, 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 no. There's a stripper pole. I'm like, again, okay, you got to lead with these kinds of things, man. What are you talking about? So I ended up having to be like, okay, was there a stripper pole in the war room? Which is like, it's like from like Doctor Strangelove, basically. I'm like, what is going on here?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Again, at an 11th hour, I have to like text people like, well, what happened? And someone was like, oh, actually, yeah, we used the lights from the stripper pole to do uplighting for the war room. It actually looked really good. And I was
Mm-hmm.
like, what? And so they like send me pictures, and I couldn't use the pictures they sent me because it would
Mm-hmm.
de-anonymize them. But I was able to pull some screenshots from the live show that showed those lights, and I was like, oh, okay. So those are the two details that were the craziest to me, and I didn't know until the day before. I was working on this for 3 months. I didn't know about any of those details
Mm-hmm.
until hours before the piece went live. So yeah,
That's incredible. I want to get into your backstory a little bit, if that's
sure.
okay.
Yeah,
I was, like I said, I read a lot of your work over the last week, and something that I thought was really cool and, it made me laugh too is that you didn't even watch football until you were on the debate team and they forced you to join their fantasy football league.
yeah.
So, how from there to now, how does that happen?
Yeah, it's really strange. I did speech and debate in high school, and then of course in college I did debate. And that was just kind of like my life, right? I was just like a speech and debate kid. I love debate. I love doing
Mhm.
all this research. I love arguing. I love doing all of that, right? And I was a bit of a nerd, right? I'm captain of the debate team, right? They can't really get a bigger nerd than that. And Also captain of the chess club, but I was the worst player on the chess club. So, I don't know why they elected me captain, but sure. Um, but yeah, I joined the debate team, and one of the coaches is like, yeah, you have to join the fantasy football league if you're going to be on the debate team. I'm like, that doesn't matter. I don't care. I'm not going to do that. Then I receive an email saying I'm invited to the fantasy football league, and I'm like, what if I don't click the link? Is like I asked them, like I'm at actually one of
Mhm.
the coaches' houses while we're all doing like a research session. So there's like 10 of us there. I'm like, what if I don't click the link? And the coach is like, well, then the team auto drafts. and it just plays the season with its auto draft. And I was like, oh, but my name is attached to the team. And they're like, yeah. And I was like, that's not happening.
Mm-hmm.
And so, because I hate losing. I despise losing,
Same.
especially when I was in college. I was like, I can't. So my name's attached to it. I'm gonna try to win. So I learned as much as I could about football. Ended up winning the league my second year, actually, not because I was good at it, but because I got Michael Vick. Uh, but I like to think it was like, I was really smart to try and grab Michael Vick off of waivers after he scored like 400 points. Uh, but yeah, I learned as much as I could about football, and it was like this really incredible, fascinating sport. And at the time, there's a bunch of really interesting pieces of writing out there. Brian Burke, who's now the lead analytics guy at ESPN, he used to run a blog called Advanced Football Stats, which then
Mm-hmm.
became Advanced Football Analytics, and then he just kind of shut down the site when he came over to ESPN. I learned a lot from that. I learned a lot from Chris Brown over at Smart Football about his um, breakdown of scheme and stuff like that. And I was like reading that, and then I was going over to ESPN or CBS Sports to try to get like previews for games and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, this is unsatisfying. This kind of
Mm-hmm.
sucks. And I think ESPN and CBS Sports are much better now. I think the football environment has changed in the past
Mm-hmm.
15 years. But at the time, I was like, this doesn't tell me anything, right? I remember in the lead up to the 2011 draft, people were talking about Cam Newton, and they're like, well, I know he's going to succeed because he's a winner. And I was like, well, I've got no idea whether or not Cam Newton's going to be good, but I think that argument sucks.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was like, well, it can't be that simple because otherwise there wouldn't be a debate. If people were good in the NFL based off the fact that they won in college, then we would see everybody try to draft national champions. And I bet that's not
Mm-hmm.
happening. So I wrote a piece about national champions and how they've done in the NFL as quarterbacks. And I just submitted it to this blog called the Daily Norseman, where they've got this
Mm-hmm.
fan post section where anybody can submit anything. So I submitted that,
Mm-hmm.
and it was pretty well received. And I just kind of kept writing a little bit here and there. Just like, I don't know if people are doing this the right way, or this doesn't make sense to me, or how do I explore this? Um, and eventually, the guy who runs the site, Christopher Gates, reached out and was like, "Hey, this is actually like pretty good stuff. We've
Mm-hmm.
highlighted some of your blogs over at Appraise. Why don't you just write for us? Like, just you be on the masthead. Your name is there. We
Mm-hmm.
might be able to credential you." And I was like, "Yeah, the rules. Yeah, I'll do that." And then I wrote there for a little bit, and I was not doing this as like a job. It didn't even occur to me that this is a job that I wanted to have at the time. I dropped out of college and I
Mm-hmm.
was doing political work. I was a director of a local nonprofit doing work to advocate for like clean water, clean air, LGBTQ rights, consumer rights, mass transit, those kinds of things. So I was gathering petitions, I was holding press conferences, I was lobbying like Klobuchar and Franken and a bunch of local state senators and representatives. And it's a tough work. It's like 80 hours a week and I got paid like $23,000 a year. Like
Wow.
it sucks. It's below minimum wage. And it was fulfilling, but it's like I can't do this. I
Mm-hmm.
cannot do this for 23,000 a year. That's crazy that I would do
Mm-hmm.
80 hours a week for this. Um but like the football stuff was beginning to take off, and so I eventually applied to write for the Bleacher Report based off of that portfolio I built over the Daily
Mm-hmm.
Norseman. They accepted me, and I was able to make a small amount of money from that. And then I was like, I wonder if I could just like do this. And
Mm-hmm.
so someone had reached out to me and was like, hey, I run this website and I don't want to run it anymore, but you're a really good writer. I was hoping maybe you could be the chief editor and then you could take in all the income from the site. I was like, oh, okay, so I can do that. And it did okay because at the time it wasn't super well known, but
Mm-hmm.
people liked my work and they read that stuff, and it just kind of built from there. I ended up going over to Zone Coverage, and then from there the Athletic, and then Pro Football Network. And it turned into a career, and I quit my politics job around the time that I was offered that chief editor position over at that blog,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, it was strange. Like I didn't think that I would ever fall in love with football, and then once I did, I didn't think I'd ever make it a career.
Mm-hmm.
But things kind of kept pushing me in that direction. So that's where I am.
That's awesome. And just one business related question for you. I see a lot of people using Substack now, especially, people that like with the entire Sports Illustrated situation, which it's very confusing to me what's happening with all of that. I try to
Yeah.
read as much as I can, but with all of that, I see more and more people using Substack. Like, how is that for writers? Like, Is it like a good platform for them or?
So I don't think that there is an ideal situation out there. I just don't. Um I think Substack is one of the better environments for a writer
Mhm.
that has already established their brand.
Okay.
And I really hate talking about like brands and stuff like that, but I mean that's just how you have to operate. If you're starting out, and if you're trying to build yourself as a writer, it is really difficult to get going with Substack, and that's for two reasons. One is that people are not going to want to pay for work that they don't recognize as necessarily
Hmm.
quality, but you might be able to run a free Substack, right? There are a couple of people out there who run free Substacks. So the second reason is actually really important, which is that Substack is deprioritized in the Twitter algorithm. Um, Elon hates Substack. Ever since Substack wanted to launch Notes, which is
Hmm.
kind of like a Twitter clone kind of thing, Elon threw a fit and for a brief moment in time banned Substack links from Twitter, and then after that deprioritized it in the algorithm and prevented you from being able to embed tweets in Substack specifically.
Wow.
Um, and links from Substack don't get just don't get as much traffic or boosting.
Hmm.
Um, Generally speaking, external links in Twitter you get pushed down in the algorithm nowadays. It didn't used to be the case, now it is.
Hmm.
But Substack in particular sees a huge hit. So if you're starting out as a writer, it is actually really difficult to use Substack to grow your platform because if you're trying to use Twitter, maybe you're using Instagram, in which case it's a
Hmm.
different set of advice and rules. But if you're trying to use Twitter to promote your work, you'll have a really difficult time because just fewer people see those tweets. And so that's another thing to kind of keep in mind. Um, Substack has been very generous to me. When I started my Substack, I had my first piece is my announcement piece. I got a bunch of subscriptions off of that.
Hmm.
Based off of that, Substack reached out to me and they're like, "Oh, hey, we want to make you part of our Substack sports brand. Let's talk." And they gave me a bunch of resources that was really nice. And I imagine for a beginning writer that wouldn't be the case,
Hmm.
that they wouldn't go out of their way to give me access to something like Getty Images. I have the rights to use Getty Images, which is really
Hmm.
nice and it makes my
Hmm.
pieces look really professional in a way that not having access to sports photography
Yeah.
wouldn't.
Hmm.
Um, I don't know that that would happen to everybody who starts a Substack. So that's something to kind of keep in mind too. So I wouldn't start there.
Hmm.
I would try to find other ways to get your name out there. And then once you've kind of built yourself in the space, and I don't know what
Hmm.
that looks like nowadays or how you can regard yourself as established, I'd say if you have fewer than 10,000 Twitter followers or whatever the equivalent is on whatever social media platform that you're using
Hmm.
to promote your work, you're probably not going to do a very good job going independent, and you're probably going to
Hmm.
need some way to, put your name out there and stuff like that. And that's just a minimum. Probably you might need like 30,000 or more. I don't know.
Hmm.
Um, but the cut that Substack takes is substantially less. So I actually I get it, there's two sets of fees I have to pay.
Hmm.
So and they're automatic. So really it's not that I have to pay, it's that I get taken out of subscription
Hmm.
fees. One is to Substack because they operate a platform and they have to get paid for it. And
Hmm.
they make insane money from writers. Like the amount of
Hmm.
money that they make from subscriptions is more than enough to cover all the services they provide me, like Getty Images,
Hmm.
to run the back end of the website, to pay developers and stuff like that. They're very profitable in that sense.
Hmm.
Then the second set of fees I have to pay is through the payment processor, which for me is Stripe.
Okay.
And so they take a cut. So I think so users pay like a $7 a month
Hmm.
subscription fee for my Substack. And then Substack, I think, takes about $1 of it. And then Stripe takes about $1.50 from it. So I see about like 4.50 from every
Okay.
subscription, which is like not bad, like especially if you compare
Hmm.
it to like Patreon, right?
Hmm.
They take a much bigger cut
Okay.
from creators. But it is like, something to kind of keep in mind is that you're not always going to get um the huge amount. The nice thing though is that versus like an established writer at like the Athletic, right?
Hmm.
I would have pieces go really well. Like some of these pieces would generate like this piece went off. It got 100 subscriptions. It got 200 subscriptions.
Wow.
I don't get a raise from that.
Hmm.
I have a quota, or I did at the Athletic have a quota for subscriptions I needed to meet. If I met that quota, I could then begin to have a conversation about getting a raise,
Okay.
um, and then my quota would increase the next year, whether or not I got that raise.
Hmm.
And so it felt a little bit like, a hamster in a wheel, right? It just
Hmm.
felt like I was kind of running. in circles, and it's like if I don't get rewarded for really good work, it's really discouraging.
Hmm.
The thing about Substack is that you get some really immediate feedback about whether or not people like your work,
Yeah.
and whether or not people want to subscribe. So if you've built a brand, Substack is great. Also, here's a funny tip. If you build a Substack and you think that you'll be successful at, sorry, and you think you'll be successful at it, get a custom URL because
Hmm.
those don't get deprioritized in the Twitter algorithm. Just the substack.com link does.
Hmm.
So I registered wideleft.football, and immediately any tweets with links to my pieces got
Hmm.
way, way more engagement. It's just a funny loophole in the way that the Twitter has decided to treat Substack. It's like, actually,
Hmm.
if you just change the URL, it works now.
Yeah.
So that's a tip. Don't use a
Hmm.
substack.com link if you can. Um,
Perfect.
yeah. So that's like my experience with like
Hmm.
independent writing platforms.
That's awesome. That's very cool. I personally, I have like I double majored in econ and international business, graduated last year. I kind of want to focus what I do creatively on a sports business route because I think obviously front office sports exists. They do phenomenal work, but I am, now you have like the Pompliano brothers and other people exploring that, but I don't think like there's like that's area is not oversaturated yet, like just normal like
Hmm.
analysis sports media is. So that's kind of where I want to go with it. I have, if it's all right with you, I have a couple of quick hitters that I'd love
Sure.
to touch
Yeah.
on.
Let's go.
I know that you mentioned Aaron Rodgers earlier. I read the Aaron Rodgers article. Backstory. He is one of my favorite football players of all time on the field. The last year, he like I the last year has been very weird to be like an Aaron
Hmm.
Rodgers fan. And like cause it's like a tie-in. When I was a kid, Madden, I would like edit everybody to be a 99 and like just have a God squad. And at punter, it would be Pat McAfee. Like I had a favorite punter and I'd edit it. So like when he retired and started a podcast, like been listening since they started putting out podcasts. And then
He's an incredible content creator. I'll give
oh,
him that for sure.
100%.
Yeah.
And then Aaron Rodgers starts coming on and he's my like favorite quarterback of all time besides Eli Manning because I'm a Giants fan. And I'm like, okay, well, this is awesome. And then, it starts to get more and more unhinged. But I was reading the article, and when you said conspiracy brain regarding Aaron Rodgers, like I literally wrote it down in my notes for this like phenomenal wordplay because a lot of people can be described that way. But I think it leads to a bigger question, as in like the morals of football.
Yeah.
And I think like even just from today's headlines for the last 24 hours, they banned the hip drop tackle for player safety, but they want two teams to play on Christmas off of 4 days rest, or four teams because two games.
Yeah.
Then that dichotomy is like, and that's not even getting into concussions and like the retired players, but like, what are your opinions? Because I think, like you said, you have come from a political background as well as a love for football. So you have a very unique perspective on things, and that shows in your writing as well. But what are your perspectives on like football morally?
Yeah, so it's actually a pretty difficult thing to kind of wrangle because I love this sport and it treats its labor awful, right? It treats its labor awfully. And that's an important part of like my political identity is that, I want to make sure that workers get treated well. Um and so like how do I kind of wrangle with this? And I was like, well, if I'm covering football and it's a thing that I understand well, am I promoting a sport that ends up doing really like a lot of damage to people? Maybe it promotes an activity that'll hurt, thousands more people when they like
Hmm.
when they sign their kids up for like middle school football or whatever. Like, am I okay with that? And it's like a constant, kind of question and answer session in my head about this. I think about it a lot. But one thing that kind of makes me realize that like this is like a difficult system to escape is that there's not a lot of industries where if I went into that industry, I wouldn't be contributing in some way to a very similar ethical dilemma of
Hmm.
some sort. Whether it has to do, and this is, I don't want this to be like a cop out. I think people need to
Hmm.
be really present with the way that they interact with the world. Actually, The Good Place of all places did like a really great job on this in like their final season. I would really highly recommend watching The Good Place.
Hmm.
But It is
Phenomenal show.
impossible to, it's insanely good.
Mhm.
It is impossible to ethically engage with the world around you. It just is. That doesn't mean you can't try and make the world a better place. You absolutely should. But you need to be aware of that, like, I can't operate without a cell phone. Well, cell phones rely on material called coltan, which is mined in places like Western Africa, that relies a lot of times on exploited labor, slave labor, and child labor.
Mhm.
That's just the case. That's just what happens. I'm speaking to you on a laptop. That's what happens, right? It used to be the case that these laptops would use motherboards or printed circuit boards, PCBs, that were developed in factories in China that had really poor labor conditions. Now the labor conditions are a lot better, but for a lot of period of its life cycle, they weren't, and a lot of workers were exposed to carcinogens. Well, if I work on laptops, or worse, quote unquote worse, if I sold laptops for a living, would I be contributing to the crisis? Yeah, of course. But
Mhm.
there's not an industry I can join that elides this fundamental problem. And that has nothing to do with even as a consumer, like when I buy a laptop or when I buy, produce that may have been picked by
Mhm.
migrant labor that was mistreated and underpaid. Um, those are just facts of the world around us, and it's very easy to get depressed about that. But it's also important to see if there are ways that you can highlight what you can do with your position to try and improve things. And so one of the
Mhm.
things that I really like about my Substack is that I do focus a lot on labor and the NFL and what it's like to work for or around the NFL. And so I do have pieces that talk about like racism in the NFL. I do have pieces that talk about the labor conditions of the NFL. I do have pieces that engage with that, and hopefully through that, there's like some meaningful accounting for or buying back of that ethical responsibility. And so
Mhm.
the easy answer is, well, every industry is unethical. And while that's true, that's a cop out. The more complex answer is every industry is unethical. So when you're working in that industry, what can you do about it to
Mhm.
kind of pull that back?
Mhm.
And so I'm not going to say I made it my mission to make football safer or better for players, but I do make it an important part of the way that I write, that I kind of, first of all, that I respect players just as people fundamentally, but second, that I kind of highlight a lot of these issues when I can. Yeah, football is a gladiatorial arena, right? It's just
Mhm.
that's what it is. And you're engaging with enjoying people try to hurt each other in some way. Um, okay, now what? Like, how do you deal
Mhm.
with that fact? And I think that that's kind of the more important thing. Whether or not you're working in this industry or that, whether or not you're working on like electric cars that purportedly, help the environment, but they rely on lithium, and lithium
Mhm.
mining can be really dangerous in a lot of ways. What can you do about that kind of meaningfully improves things for people? So
Exactly.
it's tough, but it's a way to engage with the world.
I think that was a very good answer.
Thank you.
And speaking of ethics, and I'll expand from football to just sports in general, it has been the biggest talking point in sports in the last week, where the Shohei Otani is gambling in sports.
Oh boy,
And
yeah.
you have the
I'm
richest
always
contract,
excited.
the richest contract in American sports history, $700 million over 10 years. That player is associated with a $4.5 million payment to an illegal bookie who's being investigated by the FBI. Then I believe it was yesterday or this morning that it comes out that an NBA player is under investigation because there's suspicious betting on.
Oh yeah, Jonte Parker, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, the prop
I
bets. Yeah.
I don't know who that is, and I watch a lot of basketball, and people are betting the unders, and then he's mysteriously sick 3 minutes into the game,
Yeah.
and people are betting $20,000 on a random role player on the Raptors. And you in the NFL, we've seen so many people suspended for gambling. Calvin Ridley being the biggest name so far, and I say so far on purpose because I think it's going to be impossible to rein this in. And every single time a story like this happens, you have obviously all the criticism and everything like that. And then you have what are they supposed to do? And like every segment is FanDuel, ESPN Bet, DraftKings. And like I'd love to get your opinion on.
So I'm still teasing out what I think about all this. So I was a
Mhm.
huge they should legalize sports gambling guy. And now I'm just like, Jesus Christ, what can of worms was opened here? Because like I knew that, once you legalize sports gambling, you're going to end up with a much larger audience of gambling. And maybe you have to kind of deal with like, oh, like gambling addiction and consumer responsibility and stuff like that. And that is an important part of the conversation. I didn't really recognize the huge impact that it would have in that regard, but more importantly, like what you're talking about, the way that it impacts players and people in the sport itself. And I knew that, like, okay, well, now you're gonna have to build guardrails, but those guardrails are already there, so it should be fine, right? And it's
Hmm.
not fine. It is a lot is happening. So I was like, I was way wrong about a lot of my assumptions. I also like gaming, right? So like I wanted to gamble. So I was like, okay, well, yeah, we should legalize it because I personally like it. And and so it was like, there's like this whole pushback and the first thing I noticed is that content changed. And that was the first thing that bothered me. Maybe that's just because from my point of view, I'm a producer of content. So it's the way that
Hmm.
I engage with a lot of sports is like, oh, what could be written off of this or what's a great TikTok to push off of this or whatever, right? And you're right. Like we've got ESPN Bet, which I think is through Penn,
Hmm.
that house. Which used to be associated with Barstool when they tried to
Hmm.
do gambling content, and then you've got FanDuel and DraftKings sponsorships, and um, like the most difficult thing right now for ESPN is how they handle the relationships with DraftKings and ESPN Bet, rather than how can they, because they've got relationships with both of them,
Hmm.
and it's like, well, one of the they're both sports books now, um, but like, and it's less how can we ethically report on sports in the context of also being affiliated with gaming. They're more concerned about those relationships and maintaining those relationships than they are what those relationships mean for their coverage. It's
Hmm.
very concerning to me, and a lot of the coverage is moving in that direction. A lot of these sites have altered their content to be formulated around gambling in a lot of
Hmm.
ways. Whether it's a throwaway line in a game preview that says, "Hey, so you should probably bet the under."
Yeah,
Here's an affiliate link, or if it's whole articles that are now being constructed around the SEO for, the Commanders Giants matchup over under, right?
exactly.
And now there's less being written about some of the really interesting, like, hey, Jahan Dotson's like a good receiver, we think. Let's talk about that a little bit and
Hmm.
what that might look like when he doesn't have a quarterback throwing to him or
Yeah.
whatever, right? What's going on with Scary Terry? There's like a bunch
Hmm.
of interesting stories, like
Hmm.
how Eric Bieniemy was, this coach on the rise, and now, he hasn't really done much with the Commanders as an offensive coordinator. What do we think about that? Let's break down a scheme. That's not happening. Right
Hmm.
now, we're just talking about like, hey, the Commanders when they're on the road, this is the average number of points they score. The Giants have this type of defense. These are the average amount of points that they bring up. Here are the splits in the last 5 games. This is what happens when they're coming off a streak. Here's what's happening. And a lot of these numbers don't matter. I think
Hmm.
veteran gamblers understand not to follow streaks and
Hmm.
trends. But a lot of the people consuming this content are no longer veteran gamblers. They're new consumers. And so they don't really
Exactly.
understand, like, hey, the fact that, this is what happens every time they play on Sunday night is not as important as this is what happens every time they play. Like, it's hard to parse this, right?
Hmm.
So, I don't like that. But then you get into the stuff that you talked about, which is that players are being implicated in these gambling scandals, and that is very tough. I do think that in the moment it feels much bigger than it probably is because
Hmm.
we actually went through this like in the 60s. Where players where there were players with mafia affiliations, that there were all kinds of sports gambling scandals occurring in both
Hmm.
college and professional sports, and they got a hold of it. They ended up finding a way to kind of tamp it down. It's much more difficult now because of the way
Hmm.
that technology works and the fact that you've got apps on your phone and all that. Um, the fact that the NFL is working with these casinos, that phrase sounds dangerous, but actually in this case it's good because the casinos are very stringent about the way that they do geolocation to the point where it's
Hmm.
actually obnoxious. Like if
Oh,
you're,
100%. It's
yeah,
annoying.
yeah.
Especially so I live in New Jersey. In New Jersey, you cannot bet on New Jersey college teams.
So you have to like go outside of New Jersey to
So
bet.
I literally this is last year during March Madness, Fairleigh Dickinson, FDU is going on their run. They just beat Purdue. I am on a train and as soon as I left the state, put it in. Because it was like the next game. I was like, gotta do it.
Yeah, that
And
makes sense.
speaking of college sports, I had a professor at my school. He did his PhD on gambling. He was a business school professor with an expertise in sports gambling. And I was talking to him, and I'm like, when do we get to the point where like I run into athletes all the time on this campus? What happens if I'm like, hey dude, do this today? Like I need you to get under 18 points today, or make sure your team loses, and I'll give you $2,000. And not because not every student is getting an NIL deal,
Hmm.
especially at smaller schools, and people can profit off of that so easily. And no one, if done smartly, not like betting $20,000 on Jonte Porter getting under 8 points in a game or something, whatever.
Right.
Right? If
Yeah.
done smartly, you can make millions off of something like that without it
Yeah.
being checked.
So, I think the problem is bigger for small schools than it is for
Hmm.
large schools, not just because of NIL, but because even long-term solutions are much more difficult for small schools than large schools. So a lot of the time, if you take a look at the way that they fight like corruption in law enforcement, which I
Hmm.
have all kinds of problems with law enforcement and whatever, right? But one of the ways that they've effectively fought corruption in law enforcement is paying them. Like a lot of times people take bribes because they are struggling and need to get out rather than they're
Hmm.
greedy and want to get more.
Hmm.
Now, it's gotten to the point where law enforcement officers are paid really handsomely and they're still engaging in corruption, but in different ways, and but that requires a new set of solutions. But the
Hmm.
primary thing is that when people are well compensated and get enough to get by, that they're very unlikely to engage in corruption. Now, people definitely will. I'm not saying that people aren't greedy,
Hmm.
but the primary motivation for a lot of people taking money under the table to do one thing or another, whether it's in sports or politics or law enforcement or whatever, is that they're struggling. And
Hmm.
so removing the vectors by which people can struggle is a really great way to reduce the temptation that people
Hmm.
will do that. Again, you're not going to get rid of it. People are going to be greedy and people are going to want to get a huge payoff. But like that was a problem in boxing. It still is a problem in boxing, but
Hmm.
payouts have evened out a little bit in boxing, and so it has reduced in the strength of its influence, right? So
Hmm.
that's like one thing. But again, that's if you're at Rutgers, you're going to be able to like eventually the NCAA probably is going to have to cave. The NIL I think is a band-aid. Eventually you're just going to have to pay these guys
Oh, for sure.
straight from the school. Rutgers is going to be able to do that. They can offer a living wage to all of their basketball and football players. They've got a pretty good endowment. They're the New Jersey's like it's fine. They'll be fine. Fairleigh Dickinson, I don't know, man. That one's tough. Like I don't know that they'll be able to do it.
Hmm.
Auburn or not Auburn, UAB, different.
Hmm.
They almost shut down their football program. There was a set of bad accounting practices that
Hmm.
suggested the football program was a money loser. It wasn't a money loser, but you had to disaggregate the books. Either way, you get to the point where you're paying everybody at an FCS school or a Division two school. And I don't know, because you can make a lot of money betting on FCS. You can make a lot of
Hmm.
money to betting Division two,
Hmm.
and which means you can make a lot of money ha paying off players to throw games or whatever,
Exactly.
right? And it's tough for those players to say, well, I don't need that money if they're not getting paid by the school
Hmm.
or the NCAA. So that one is a much tougher nut to crack. But I think at the base level, making sure that everyone's taken care of does help reduce that. That's not going to eliminate Jonte Porter. He makes a fine salary.
Hmm.
But I would bet that you get a lot more basketball corruption if there wasn't as much evenness in basketball salaries as there
Hmm.
is right now.
Hmm.
So I think at that level, that's the first line of defense. And
Hmm.
then from there, you have to just be pretty diligent. And now that we've got, um, machine learning software, I don't want to talk about AI, but machine learning software that can detect spikes in movement, um, that you can do a better job of catching that kind of stuff, right? And
Hmm.
so like they caught Jonte Porter because it was weird that people were betting $20,000 on an under in a game that he only played 3 minutes in, right?
Hmm.
So and those kinds of spikes can be easier and easier to identify in the same way the financial industry has
Exactly.
been able to use these elements of machine learning for like a decade to
Hmm.
detect unusual activity and alert like law enforcement and say, hey, FTO, this might be a terrorist organization you might have to designate. We might
Hmm.
need to freeze this account. Let's investigate.
Hmm.
So a lot of those same tools could be used here. There's a lot of the problems. have solutions in other industries that we might be able to turn to.
Yeah, for sure. I have two questions for you, if that's all right.
Sure. What's up?
Perfect. Thank you for your time. My first one is in line with all of this, because I read your piece about how the Super Bowl is a politically
You read
charged
a lot of
event.
these pieces, man. These are not short pieces.
I every single day when I woke up, whatever class I had in the morning, or actually no, for every class, because I have a lot of trouble paying attention, especially during Zoom University, I would go on the Athletic and go on the Ringer and just open up every article that I found interesting and just like make my way through them throughout the day.
Okay, yeah, I've been there. I get it.
So
Yeah.
I love reading my like I don't know if you can see it, like there are multiple stacks of books behind me, and like that's not on top of the bookshelves and everything. But I was reading that, and where is the line between sports and politics, and does it even exist anymore?
I mean, I think the line is really blurred. I don't want to make the mistake of saying that because it's really difficult to tell where that line begins and ends, that there is no difference. There is, but there is no sports without politics. Because sports emerge from a society, and all those societies have to make decisions. And the way that societies make decisions is politics, whether or not it occurs through the government or not. If we all collectively agree to do something, we've made a political decision, whether or not that's something that we acknowledge through a law or legislature or whatever. Um, and so they can't exist independent from society because that's what they are. These players have lives that they go through. We have to pay for these stadiums. They occupy a certain amount of time and attention and energy, and they carry their own set of values that they communicate to us, whether it's that teamwork is good. And again, a thing being political doesn't mean it's not universal, right? We
Hmm.
all agree teamwork is good, but that doesn't mean it's not a value. And if it's a value, it's a way we should think about society. If it's a way we should think about society, it's a political statement,
Hmm.
right? That doesn't mean it's contentious or controversial. Teamwork rules,
Hmm.
right? But a lot of values are communicated in sports, and a lot of these values sometimes conflict with other values that are held in society. And so when they're given a platform, that creates kind of a political scaffolding by which other people start attaching themselves to. So, for example, it's my personal belief that we don't live in a very meritocratic society.
Hmm.
I have benefited from society in a big way. My hard work has paid off, but a lot of that has to do with how lucky I am, which is not to say I don't work hard or that my work isn't good.
Hmm.
I think both of those things are true, but I'm in a spot where I was lucky enough for that to turn into something. A lot of people work
Hmm.
hard, a lot of people produce good work, and it doesn't turn out for them. I don't think we live in a very meritocratic society.
Hmm.
Sports sells a narrative that is inherently meritocratic, right? If you're the best player, you'll win. If you work hard, you'll become a better player.
Hmm.
All of those things. If you practice more, you'll become. And it's not like those things aren't necessarily true,
Hmm.
right? The better your team is, the more likely you are to win the Super Bowl. That's duh, right?
Hmm.
So I'm not saying that these aren't true. What I'm saying is that sometimes the narratives that sports sells are narratives that we tend to consciously or unconsciously absorb into what we do. And then from there, how we think about the world around us. And if we're really into sports, a lot of times we'll believe in a bunch of meritocratic understandings of the
Hmm.
world, which will then apply to, like, let's say, a corporate environment or something. So that's at a very base level that you can't really separate sports from politics because sports gets embedded in our value system, and that's what defines our politics.
Hmm.
But then that piece doesn't even talk about any of that stuff. That piece is mostly about like advertisers and the way that people have interacted with like Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce and a bunch of other stuff. Um, and that's just how we then, so I think it's like circling back around from the value creation process, which is political,
Hmm.
to the application process of those values from politics back onto sports. And so there's all these culture war type things that we impose on sports. And I think a lot of people are like, well, when I watched football in the 90s, it wasn't like this. And it's like, no, you're wrong. You just don't remember it. Maybe it
Hmm.
wasn't this weird psycho Taylor Swift is like a conspirator. Like that's nuts. I agree that that
Hmm.
didn't happen in the 90s.
Hmm.
But a lot of political messages were attached to players and attached to teams and attached to political sports moments in the
Hmm.
90s that we just kind of don't remember because we've absorbed it in some way or the other. And so it's always been like that. In the 60s, desegregation in baseball was a big part of the way that we talked about the sport, and also happened to be a big way we talked about how our society should be organized. It was political, right?
Hmm.
Um, and sports always has a contact point with the rest of society as a result of that, because they have to make decisions in their sport, and a lot of those decisions have parallels or are directly related to the things that are occurring in a broader society. So I
Hmm.
don't think sports can't be political. That
Hmm.
doesn't mean that the decision to call cover three or cover one is a political decision.
Hmm.
There is a sports and there's a politics, and there's a difference, but they enmesh with each other really significantly.
And if you look at the 100 most watched events, more than likely, besides like some major award shows, it's going to be either sports, specifically football, or something like the State of the Union or an election year debate.
Yeah.
And because I think those are, and if you look at media, like those are the two biggest cover topics are politics and sports. And
Yeah,
they,
sports keep newspapers afloat. I wish that
hmm,
wasn't the case, but that is the best-selling portion of a local
hmm,
newspaper is the sports section.
for
And
sure.
very often they end up getting they tend to be the best paid writers. Wasn't
Hmm.
true in my case. But I was just starting out. But yeah, there's that. You mentioned 93 of the most watched 100 broadcasts of 2023 were NFL football. Another three were college football. Another one was the show that followed the Super Bowl. And it was just three, the State of the Union and an award ceremony and the Macy's Day Parade, that were not directly related to football.
Hmm.
It's king. People
Yeah,
consume football.
which is like you said, it's good and bad because then once you're like, and I think this applies to everything, is once you have a lot of power and there's no challenge to it, then you get complacent and you don't care as much about evolving and getting better.
Yeah.
But which I think, people debate whether Goodell is a good commissioner or not all the time. I think from a pure business standpoint, he's a phenomenal commissioner.
Oh, yeah, 100%.
And
He's incredible at the job that he is actually asked to
mhm,
do.
100%. And like
Yeah.
aside from some very like notable misses in terms of punishment for certain actions and things like that, like he has, especially like I think like the last like 3 to 4 years, like they've done a bit, like he's done a better job dealing with things. And I think he's like getting more used to dealing with it, but definitely I wouldn't want his job.
Oh, I definitely wouldn't want his job.
Like
Uh,
that's having to
yeah,
answer
like
to
so
31 billionaires and
yeah.
keep your investors happy and keep the politicians happy and keep fans happy, like miserable job.
Yeah, and the reason that he's so successful and the reason that the NFL keeps on re-upping his contract is exactly what you said, is that he knows what his job is, and he knows that, he's not going to keep everyone happy, so he figures out who he needs to keep happy, and he keeps
Hmm.
them happy, and it's the 31 billionaires that vote to keep him and then extend a contract and
Hmm.
negotiate a salary.
Exactly.
It is not the millions of fans that boo him at the draft. In fact, when they boo him, I think that he understands, like, my job is for them to boo me instead of Jerry Jones. And
Exactly.
so I'm doing my job by taking all the hits,
Hmm.
and the NFL loves it. Now,
Hmm.
would I prefer to not be booed? Yeah, I guess.
Probably.
But, if I'm booed, that means, Rod Kraft is not being booed, right?
Exactly.
So, yeah, no, I mean, his ability to negotiate television deals is out
Phenomenal.
of this world. I don't love what has emerged from that. I don't like that you have to get like a Peacock subscription to watch like two playoff games. I hate
Hmm.
that. But billion-dollar deals with like Amazon and NB, like that is incredible stuff. And the reason the salary cap keeps on jumping up in these
Hmm.
crazy ways is because he's negotiated these really incredible television deals at the expense of a lot of things that I think would be more ethical,
Hmm.
right? Player safety, like you mentioned, games on Wednesdays. Um, making sure that fans have access to the game instead of having to subscribe to three different subscription services.
Hmm.
Preventing blackouts, which is like a relic of the 60s anyway.
Oh, it's
Um, it's really stupid. Stuff like that. Like, I think that that is kind of unethical. Like, I don't know that we have a
hmm.
right to football games, but still, I'm going to call it kind of unethical. Flex scheduling so that you can move teams that are more dynamic late in the season into prime time slots.
Hmm.
Really great TV move, really bad for the fans.
Hmm.
That kind of stuff, right? Like, I think that, and I think he realizes that, man, has it really and he's really good at negotiating against the players union, which is like
Hmm.
a huge part of his job is to be a lead negotiator in the CBA. And he kills them in an era where we've got a little bit more labor empowerment than we've had in the last 20 years. He is demolishing the NFLPA.
Hmm.
And I think they've had better leadership in a long time than they've had in a while. I think JC Treader does an incredible job,
Hmm.
and he's still killing them. He's
Hmm.
destroying them. So I don't like that he's good at his job, but man, is he good at his job.
And you might have similar sentiments about the last person that I want to ask you about. We touched on him a little bit earlier. Like I said, I've been a fan of Pat McAfee since his podcast started in 2017. I have watched it religiously. I'm at the point now where if I don't watch it or I have to like pause it to like go do actual like work or something else in the middle, like I it feels weird not watching it daily at like the same time that I'm used to watching it. Like watched it while I did all my homework, like everything. And since the ESPN deal, obviously, like at first the ESPN deal gets announced and his like a lot of the fans are killing him for it. Like his own fans are killing him for it because they think he's selling out. They think like the show is going to be a buttoned up first take style show.
Yeah, it'd be like PTI or something. Like,
Exactly. And he's
whatever.
like,
Yeah.
just trust me, guys. Like I remember like on the Reddit for the show, like I was like, bro, guys, like just trust him. Like he's been himself like every single time. And I think like that's not something that we get in sports media anymore is people being themselves. Like Stephen A. Smith, the TV personality, is amazing. I grew up watching him. I know what blasphemous and unmitigated gall is because of Stephen A. Smith, but he's a much different person off camera than he is on camera. And like he's been very apparent about making sure people know that. But like with someone like Pat McAfee and the rest of his crew, it's like they are genuinely themselves on camera. And I think that's what endears people to them. I think that's why ESPN is paying however much they are, in spite of all the financial struggles that Disney has as a company right now. But I've also been like, maybe it was like naiveness. I was like, oh, like everybody must like him. But like the negativity that has come from, especially like now it's a mainstream show, has surprised me. And some of it has come from like full-fledged journalists. Some of it has come from, fans. I remember someone like some like old lady from the South in my mentions like, oh, I don't want to see him in a tank top on college game day. It's like he was literally wearing a suit jacket every single day. Like he wore a suit jacket. Like I don't know what your problem is,
He's
right?
fun on game day. I have no issues with him on game
Hmm.
day. He's great at that.
But yeah, like I gave a whole soliloquy. Like, what is your
Um,
take on him, the show, like everything?
when he first started out, I really loved it. And well, I guess I should say first started out because I didn't consume his content on like Sirius XM when he like first
Hmm.
started out. But like his YouTube channel when it first launched, I watched like a good portion of it. Like I still remember the show where he told the Troy Polamalu story, which I think that clip is like his most watched clip on
Hmm.
YouTube still. Um, Great story, great storytelling, great enthusiasm and charisma, and he hits all the notes and he has a really good understanding. And I think it's because he was so interested in wrestling in
Hmm.
college. Because like he did a local wrestling promotion at like West Virginia,
Hmm.
and then when he was still in the NFL, he signed to the WWE and he got some training from that wrestling. So he has a really good understanding of how storytelling in that context works, and you can
Hmm.
tell that really fits with who he is as a person as well,
Hmm.
right? I respect him for signing with Barstool and then leaving because they weren't transparent with him,
Hmm.
which is different from like not being a culture fit. Like I'd rather
Yeah.
he had left because he's not a culture fit, but whatever.
Hmm.
Um, but I respect that he did that because he kind of understood, what he brings to the table and what he deserves, right? And that's great. And then the show continued to be really entertaining. Personally, I grew out of the show. Not I don't want to say grew out of it because like I grew up, but rather I phased out of the show. Maybe that's a better way to
Hmm.
put it. Because it was too much all the time. He had a lot of personality. And it felt like kind of a similar gimmick all the time. But that's just a qualitative thing. That has nothing to do with a lot of the criticism that he's receiving now. I still think that he's great on game day. I think that they need to inject that kind of charisma and personality into ESPN game day. I kind of wish he was a little bit more familiar with the teams that are being
Mm-hmm.
featured on game day, but I know that's not a shtick either, so I don't want to bust his chops too much for that. But minor criticisms. The thing that bothers me is that most of his segments are great when he brings on like Pac-Man Jones. Those are great interviews,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, the thing that bothers me is that he gets put into a position that he kind of doesn't want to be put into, but he still wants to engage with it. Because he gets put into a position where now he has to do journalism, and he has a responsibility to his audience in a big
Mm-hmm.
way when he brings these heavy topics into the fore. And I know that the spirit of the show is like, hey man, we're just a bunch of guys hanging out, and sometimes UFOs are going to come up, and
Mm-hmm.
every group of bros is going to talk about UFOs if UFOs are in the news. And it's like, yeah, that rules. I love talking about UFOs. I get where he's coming from,
Mm-hmm.
right? But like when you bring on somebody that continues to recount conspiracy theories and uh provoke dangerous
Mm-hmm.
reactions and share dangerous theories and information unchecked, unchallenged, then now he's in a spot where he is spreading misinformation,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not coming out of his mouth, but it's coming from his show. And given the nature of the contract that he has with ESPN, where ESPN is not really allowed to interfere with the show, which is
Phenomenal
crazy.
negotiating.
Yeah, oh my God. Um, I when I learned that, which I only learned after the fact, right?
Mm-hmm.
After like all of this happened and ESPN wasn't allowed to ban him from hosting it. I was like, ESPN's not allowed to ban him from Aaron Rodgers. That's crazy. Um, well, now it's on him. Now it's entirely his
Mm-hmm.
responsibility, right? And so now he has to make sure that when something like that comes up that has the potential to be dangerous, that he pushes back, that he
Mm-hmm.
interrogates, that he makes sure that people understand that this is a fringe view. And he's not equipped for that.
Mm-hmm.
His wrestling training didn't give him that. It
Mm-hmm.
gave him 95% of what he needed, and now the moment requires something else.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there's two things here. One, is that you need to have a journalistic instinct to know when to do that,
Mm-hmm.
especially because they switch from joke to serious lightning quick.
Yeah.
Um, in some of the clips that I shared of Aaron Rodgers sharing a conspiracy, the previous thing they were talking about was 100% a joke. And so, like, you gotta like know that that's a tough one, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
Aaron Rodgers was talking, I think, in one of the clips, he's talking about the Super Bowl conspiracy, right? Where you take a look at the colors of the logos of the Super
Yeah.
Bowl, and that's going to tell you who's in the Super Bowl. Obviously, he's joking about that, and the
Mm-hmm.
way that he carries himself, it's a joke. And then they transition into another conspiracy that he just believes, and he starts saying it like it's a little bit more serious. And now you're in this weird spot where I have to be like, am I doing something here? Am I
Yeah.
responsible for this? So like he's got to have that instinct, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is a part of the job. And then he's got to have the equipment to be able to challenge that, right? And so when Aaron Rodgers says that like um ivermectin is a great way to prevent COVID, Pat McAfee can't respond with, yeah, it's actually really difficult to get ivermectin. I wonder what that. No, you can't. That's not the right response,
Mm-hmm.
dog. That is crazy. You got to
Mm-hmm.
push back. There is no evidence that ivermectin does anything with regards to COVID-19. Now, there's a lot of stuff that people have said about ivermectin in pushing back against this conspiracy that's wrong. It is a medicine approved for humans. That's fine. And it engages the conspiracy theorists when you say the wrong stuff in that capacity.
Mm-hmm.
But it is meant to treat parasites in humans, and it is not meant to treat viruses, nor has
Mm-hmm.
there been any indication that it can treat viruses, and no testing has determined that it can treat viruses in humans, right? And so that's what you got to push back with
Mm-hmm.
when that topic comes up. And maybe you're never going to be equipped for that. Maybe it's just like I'm confident this guy has ADHD.
Oh, for
Just by
sure.
the right. Which is fine because he's turned it into an asset of his. But if that makes it difficult for him to read studies, fine, totally understandable. Bring somebody on and
Mm-hmm.
have somebody, even if it's not directly to Rogers, which is preferable,
Mm-hmm.
have somebody challenge it later on air in the
Mm-hmm.
same episode. So that's what needs to happen, and that's my issue is that he doesn't know when he's sitting on something that requires some level of
Mm-hmm.
journalistic intervention, and so now he's turned from a guy with a fun show to a guy who's platforming something dangerous, and he
Mm-hmm.
doesn't have the instinct to kind of understand when and where and how that gets played out. So that's my issue. I don't really
Hmm.
watch the show anymore because it's a lot less entertaining to me because it's a lot of person at once. But I do think that is primarily a very engaging and entertaining show, even on
Hmm.
ESPN. But it's when he lacks the journalistic instinct to challenge like a pyramids conspiracy that I'm like, ah, bud.
I think just from like I said, like watching the show, I think like their main MO when something like that happens is just to like laugh it off because they know it's not like believable and they trust that like the viewer will do it, but like I don't think we can trust the viewer anymore, especially now.
Yeah. Yeah, and when it comes from a place of maybe authority is the wrong word, but a place of respectability where
Hmm.
Aaron Rodgers carries a lot of weight, you gotta you gotta at some point. And I understand that it's a buzzkill to be like, hey, we got a guest on and he's wrong and we were joking around and he said something while we were joking around, but we gotta make the record clear,
Hmm.
set the record straight that this that and the other thing is untrue and
Hmm.
all our evidence says this. um it sucks, but that's what happens when you like, I'm sorry, but you're getting paid millions of dollars, so
Hmm.
there's only so much sympathy I can lend to you
For
on
sure.
this one. um Trust the viewer to make discerning statements from well-respected figures is like never a good
Hmm.
practice.
Yeah.
And you can do a lot of damage by not properly informing viewers who are encountering some kind of information for the first time.
Hmm. For sure. I think what makes him endearing to me personally is like what you talked about is like too much person at one point. It's the fact that he fully like blatantly acknowledges that. Like he says,
Mhm.
I get sick of myself sometimes. It's like fully because like it's very rare that like someone like sees someone like them and like personality wise, similar background, anything like that, like successful. And like the bouncing off the ball wall energy, the undiagnosed ADHD, if you will, which I say I have that all the time because and like if you like you watch it like never sit still, like interjects all the time, which
He's
can get
literally standing the whole show.
oh
Yeah.
it was funny
This
today.
pile of toys that sometimes he like knocks over. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, I get it.
Today on the show, he was standing up and Raheem Morris came on the show and like stood up with him. He stood up the
That's
entire
great.
time too.
That's great. That's
Which is
good.
hilarious. He's like, I'm not gonna let you intimidate me by standing up. But I think it's definitely like your none of the points that you made are like contestable at all. Like even as a diehard fan of the show, if you will. I just think that like there's unwarranted hate
Oh, 100%.
that and I promise this last thing. Like I
Well,
sorry if I took
let me say this super
Mhm.
quick. The culture that he represents is often detestable. And so I understand where the hate comes from because a lot of people have been hurt by frat bros, right? A lot of people have had negative experiences with frat
I
bros for
don't
whatever
like
reason.
them.
Yeah, and he feels like a frat bro, right? And so I think that's a lot of it is that like culturally he attaches to a guy I've had a bad experience with.
Hmm.
So I don't like him, and I'm gonna kind of maybe project is the wrong word, but I'm gonna look at him through that lens.
Hmm.
And so I get it. I don't like frat bros a lot. I mean, I do have friends who were in frats that got kind of broy, so I don't want to be universal about it. But
No.
I've had a lot of bad experiences with people
Same.
from frats, right? So
Same.
I think that's where a lot of it comes from, where it's like less that they're engaging with what he does
Hmm.
and more engaging with what it feels like he represents.
But I also like genuinely think that that's like those people are like very surface level like watchers of what he's doing because like there's like specific moments like if you hear him talk like you can see like yes he dresses like a frat bro he acts like one more often than not but like they spent 15 minutes on the show talking about like his struggles in like becoming a parent and then when he called into the show from the hospital it was like just detailing the entire process is probably like my favorite moment of like that entire show. And like obviously like the overall stupidity, like they have Arnold Schwarzenegger on the show, and like an hour later someone shits their pants. Like the overall stupidity of the show is phenomenal. They had a 6-year-old
Yeah.
call and curse one of them out. Like just a fun time watching it, which I think that's why it's appealing and that's why ESPN wanted it because like there's very few things that like it's a 3.5 hour show of his every day. Like there's very few things that like 90, like 75% of it even is like fun to watch. And like you're not like pissed off at something or you're not like stressing about what you're seeing on the news and like they don't take people down unless they have to. Like it's not like like normal ESPN doing LeBron versus Jordan and the Dallas Cowboys on repeat every day.
Yeah.
And
I will say this though. I don't like how he treated Brett Coleman, who's a friend of mine,
mhm.
with
Oh,
regards
for
to the whole
sure.
charity thing. And he did own it a little bit. It took
Hmm.
a while, I'll say that, but he did own it, which is
Hmm.
nice. But sometimes he'll kind of go a little bit far. But I agree that those are rarities. But when you said that he doesn't take people down, I was like, well, it's like the one
No,
time.
no, fully. He he also like and like I think he's himself like said it like there are times where he gets very sensitive to the Twitter comments
Hmm.
and that leads to some of the like that situation which from what I recall correctly and like I thought I was like oh okay it was like a happy accident that it happened for me because I found out who Brett Coleman was and his content is really really good and
Really good
I
content.
love
Yeah.
watching it now but it I think those situations are like yeah, it was like in the moment it's like what is happening here? Like it is completely off brand for what you think the human is. But then it's like I agree with you though. Like that was definitely a very awkward moment in the entire
Yeah, and
path.
I wouldn't say that that characterizes the way that he generally conducts
Hmm.
himself. It was just like, hey, I gotta get this out
Oh,
here.
100%. I agree with you.
Yeah.
And absolute last question, since I know that you're a Vikings fan.
Hmm.
Who do you want a quarterback?
I mean, Caleb Williams, right? But that's not gonna happen. So I think of the achievable quarterbacks, probably Drake May.
Okay.
It's a very chalk answer, but I think it's like Caleb Williams is almost in a tier of his own, like tier one Caleb Williams, tier 1.5 Drake May, tier three Jaden Daniels, tier five JJ McCarthy,
Really?
tier seven. Yeah, I think there's a huge separation between all these people. Um, like I think Jaden Daniels is to me is the third best quarterback prospect
Hmm.
in the draft. I am concerned about his build and his age, right? But I just think that he is more explosive and carries a lot more big play potential in a way where I'm not worried as much about his negatives than
Hmm.
somebody like a JJ McCarthy. And so to me, Jaden Daniels is the third best quarterback. I think there's a separation between him and McCarthy. I do like McCarthy as the youngest quarterback in this draft. I do like that he's got a pretty decent eye for stuff. I do like that he hangs in the pocket, keeps his eye up. He's super tough, and he's a pretty good athlete.
Hmm.
But I don't like the way he makes decisions. So that's where I am. But like Bo Nix is like a no go for me.
Hmm.
I hate that offense, and it's also the only offense he's been successful in. So I'm just
Hmm.
like I'm good.
Yeah.
And Michael Penix, both Penix and Michael Penix are really old, but Michael Penix has like this broken mechanic that I don't think is
Hmm.
fixable, and he's got like four season-ending injuries.
His numbers
So
against pressure, like Michael Penix's numbers against pressure aren't like they
yeah,
are
and so
not they're awful basically.
And I think that that's not a product of him panicking against pressure. I think it's a product of his really poor mechanics that
Hmm.
do a really poor job of adjusting to changes in the
Exactly.
pocket. And so I don't know how fixable that is. So I think I would say that McCarthy clears both of them by a pretty substantial
Hmm.
margin, but I also would not take him above Jaden Daniels. So that's kind of my order, but
I think he should be the fourth quarterback taken.
McCarthy?
Yeah. At the
Hmm.
same time, he is by far my favorite quarterback in this draft.
Really?
I love like I want him on the Giants so badly.
Is it because he's like super tough and or what's the appeal for you?
I I don't know. This is a weird way of judging things, especially draft prospects, but I feel like it's the only like I'm not gonna say like, oh, I know how to evaluate every draft prospect because no one will ever know how to do that, which is why it's so hard and people get paid millions of dollars to make that decision. At the same time, I think if you look at someone like Jalen Hurts, you look at a CJ Stroud, like I think you can chart how much better a player is getting year after year. I think that's something that people can do, and then you can chart personality. Wins are obviously not a quarterback stat. That is the biggest myth in football. Um, Personally, why I don't think Tom Brady's the GOAT, because I think he
I'm
gets
with you there. Well, I mean, you're a
hyped up
Giants fan, but still, I'm with you
to
there.
beat him twice. If anybody would want to say he's the GOAT, it's a Giants fan because we beat him twice, so we beat the GOAT twice. But like I don't
And
think
yet, I never see a Giants fan do it.
but like he's not the GOAT. But
Who?
I
Okay,
think
so who is the goat? Because I've got my answer. Who's the
okay,
goat for?
in terms of pure talent quarterbacking, I think it's like pure arm talent, pure every trait that you'd want in a quarterback. It's Aaron Rodgers, in my opinion.
Really? Okay, I don't think a lot of people have that as their answer.
I don't. At the same time, I'm 22, so I wasn't alive when a lot of the other people in this conversation would be playing.
If we take wins out of the equation, I know we're like way off topic now. If we take wins out of the equation, the two quarterbacks that I think are like almost clear everybody are Peyton Manning and Dan Marino. They are insanely good. The 2004 season for Peyton Manning was so insane. It was so outstanding. And then he was able to maybe not reproduce that, but play at that level for so long.
I mean,
Um,
he threw for 55 touchdowns after four neck surgeries.
yeah, what a
But I
dude.
love him. I love him so much. Obviously, Giants fan, Manning family connections.
Right.
But I love Peyton Manning and the fact that like Omaha is like a monster in the
In
sports media
production.
world doesn't
Yeah.
surprise me
Yeah.
whatsoever. Get knowing
Yeah.
him, Dan Marino. Like if you look at his stats and like realize that was the 1990s,
You're
it's
right.
insane.
That's the thing. It's like his 1984 season. Um, if you dropped those stats into today, would be among the league leaders in like
Hmm.
passer rating in 1984. What is going on? So, I mean, those are my two.
Hmm.
Obviously, I like Joe Montana. I secretly think Steve Young was better. Uh, but yeah, super interesting conversation. I don't want to leave Tom
Hmm.
Brady out of it, but I agree he's not the GOAT.
I
Hey, Patrick Mahomes is going to take all of it anyway, so I
oh
don't really care.
100%.
Yeah.
I think it's too early to say. Like I from a pure quarterbacking standpoint though, like combining the Hail Mary throws, combining the ability to draw people off sides at a higher rate than anybody else that I've ever seen.
That's so frustrating. Jesus
And
Christ.
just oh, as a Vikings fan, I can imagine.
Yeah.
And just like the overall like innate like quarterbacking ability. Like
Yeah, I mean his 2011 season was
phenomenal.
out of this
His
world.
But like there's like the specific memories that I have of him are like the Chicago game where he had missed like it was Khalil Mack's first game as a Bear. He sacked him. He missed like the entire first half, came out on one leg and led like a three touchdown comeback. And then obviously the Cardinals game in the playoffs where he threw two Hail Marys to win the or to win or tie, I forget. I think they ended up losing the
Yeah.
game.
Um, did they? I think they won that game because I remember a deep pass to Jeff Janis of all people.
I remember, but then the Panthers beat the Cardinals in the NFC Championship
Oh no,
game to
you're
go
right.
play
You're
Denver
right. You're
because
right.
his
What a
teams were never
weird
good.
Cardinals team. That was a Carson Palmer Cardinals team, right?
Exactly. Carson Palmer, Blue
God,
Arians.
what a good
What
season
a
Carson Palmer had.
The Cardinals have had their Cardinals like two best seasons in my lifetime have been when they resurrected a quarterback in Kurt Warner and Carson Palmer. But back to
Yeah,
JJ,
yeah.
right? It's like it's innate things. Like I think that obviously they relied on running the ball a lot because they had a very good run blocking offensive line and they had Blake Corum and Donovan Edwards who are phenomenal. At the
Donovan
same
Edwards
time,
is all right, but yeah, I agree.
Blake Corums. I think like the combination of the two of them, like
Yes,
that's
yeah,
probably the
yeah,
best backfield in the country.
yeah.
The last 2 years. But at the same time, teams would sell out against a roll, and like that would leave them in like third and long a lot of times, and like it would be up to him to figure out what to do. And the running backs are great, but outside of Roman Wilson, like who's not a first round caliber receiver, no offense to him, but like he's not in this day and age of what we have at receiver. Like the pass catching weapons were not like at Ohio State or Georgia or Alabama level for him.
Well,
And
they've got that tight end. Was it Loveland? I think he's
I
going to be
think
like
so.
a he's going to be like a first or second round pick next year. I mean, he had a
He
couple of
is
guys.
he didn't have like Daniel Jones weapons at Duke, but like he didn't have Waddle, Devontae Smith, and Henry
Right? Yeah,
Ruggs
yeah.
either.
Yeah, I'll give
So
it to you that he didn't. Yeah, yeah.
like it's not like even like this year. Like it's not like Marvin Harrison and I cannot pronounce his name, the double E's blanking
Oh, Emeka Igbugba or something like
there.
that.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
it's not like he had them either. But he would always figure out what to do on third down. He obviously like you're gonna get bad decisions from like a 19-year-old and a 20-year-old quarterback, but like I also think the age factor
That
benefits
is
him great.
huge.
It's
Yeah.
huge because like in my opinion, like I want the Giants to draft him. You get Dable's hands on him, and he's gonna come out looking incredible. I think the Vikings offense with JJ would be hilariously good in a Shanahan scheme offense with Kevin O'Connell and all the weapons you guys have. Um, I also put a lot of like I said, I put a lot of stock into like improving and like mindset. I think that's the only thing that you can like really judge for a person is
Hmm.
like in spite of like the success and like everything else, like what their mindset is. And the fact that at 19 years old, he said we'll be back here after they lost to TCU and they go through both Harbaugh scandals and they don't lose a single game playing in a fairly like the second best conference in the country, and they beat Alabama in the Rose Bowl in Nick Saban's last game, and then they dominate Washington in the college football champion like in the championship game. Like I put stock into how big of a leader he was for that team at like such a young age. And I think like we talked about mechanics earlier, like I think his mechanics are good and what's not good is
They're pretty
teachable
good.
given the young age that he has.
Yeah, they're pretty good mechanics, actually. I agree. Um, yeah, I just kind of wish that he had more. I don't know how else to
I
put it,
think that's the I think if he was in Washington's offense with those receivers, I think he would have put up.
Well, it's less about, how often he threw the ball, because I know that his third and long conversion rate's actually among the better ones
Hmm.
among all the college prospects. It's less that. It's more that I just don't see a ton of explosive plays coming from him at an NFL level,
Hmm.
especially like I know that he threw like 61 at the combine, but that's just I don't think that the miles per hour assessment's actually all that useful. I think that the zip on the ball on deep outs is bad, and I think that his ball placement on deep shots is poor. And again, you can probably fix the ball placement stuff, but I think some of that is a decision making issue. And so to me, there's just not a lot of explosive potential in what he does. There's a lot of explosive potential in the guys that I rank ahead of him, and technically more explosive potential with Michael Penix. But
Yeah.
again, and I do value that a lot in quarterbacks. I used to not. I used to be a very I love Peyton Manning, which means I love Teddy Bridgewater, which means I love Derek Carr. Like
Hmm.
being explosive wasn't important. I wanted you to be right all the time. And now I've kind of shifted because of Mahomes and Allen and Lamar Jackson that it's
I
like you got to have 20-yard plays in you.
I think I think he can get there. Like once again, I think the age factor and having the right coaching, like Josh Allen, like had that innate ability to make huge plays, but he didn't have it all together, and like Dable got him to where he is now. I think that can be done with JJ McCarthy under the right tutelage. So I don't know. I'm hopeful for him. I'm very high on him. I could be phenomenally wrong. That's
And
just
we always could be.
how
That's
it
just part of the
works.
game. Yeah.
I like as a Giants fan, I think we should go get a quarterback this year and then get receiver in the second round.
It's going to be, I mean, I agree. I think that holding on to Daniel Jones is a mistake, and the contract is the contract, right?
So
So
next year, if we cut him
yeah, you
after
got it out, right? Because
we
it's a
$10
very
million,
team friendly
dollars,
contract.
$10
Yeah.
million. Dollars.
It was-
The issue is if he gets hurt at all this year
oh, it's
and he
guaranteed for injury, right?
he has like a $48 million injury guarantee. So
I mean, it was still like I think in the context, it still wasn't as bad a contract as people said it was
no.
because it was only a 2-year contract.
It was a
Um,
2-year 80 million deal with the potential to be very good if he developed like you wanted him to,
yeah,
which that was the
but
position you were put in.
yeah, but I agree that the Giants should grab a quarterback. I think it's going to be tough just because of all the teams that want to trade up, whether it's the Broncos, the Vikings
That's
obviously have
why
positioned
the
themselves.
Vikings making a very smart trade 2 weeks ago pissed me off
Yeah, it should.
because I was like, they're gonna do.
Yeah.
But I
Plus,
would
plus the
be
Commanders are not going to trade in division, so
oh of course not. But whatever you have to do to go get a quarterback
yeah,
because then you just play Drew Lock for a little bit and then play the quarterback.
yeah.
Because I don't think they're going to trot Daniel Jones out there with a 48 million injury guarantee.
I mean that's part of the reason that Russell Wilson got benched in Denver, right?
Hmm.
It's because they
But
didn't want the injury guarantee. But if they don't have anybody, they're going to play Daniel Jones. That's
yeah,
just it.
they'll have to. But that's why I think they'll go get one. because he's already like missed time twice, like extensive time because of neck issue, which is terrifying just in general. And then he's coming
Plus,
off
he's kind
a
of reckless.
torn ACL. Oh, he is. He's
Yeah.
hilarious to watch play football,
It's
and
so funny, dog. It's so
I
funny.
like I really wish like I'm rooting for him still. Like whatever ends up happening with him for his career, like I will be always root for him. I snuck into Giants training camp my before my freshman year of college, like his rookie season. I snuck into the VIP section and he signed a football for me.
Nice.
So I have it like in a replica box up there. But no, it's like it sucks when you like, and I'm sure like some Steelers fans feel this way, and I know Chicago fans feel this way, but like it sucks when a rookie quarterback does, like when a drafted quarterback doesn't work out.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
it,
It
like
was like I
because
I remember like the Vikings haven't had a lot of them, but I remember Christian Ponder not working out was like really it hurt a lot of fans. Teddy Bridgewater not working out was more an injury story tragedy than anything else, but it yeah, it really sucks when that rookie is just not doing it.
like you put so much hope into it.
Yeah, yeah, there's a lot of emotional investment.
Yeah, like and being a Giants fan is not emotionally positive,
Try being a
but
Vikings fan, man. That's way worse.
yeah, 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 yeah. But oh, also phenomenal headline for the Kirk Cousins article.
Thank you.
Phenomenal headline for people that don't know. It's Cousins, comma once removed. And as we found out with Skip Bayless, commas are really important.
What a tweet.
But oh, that was the internet had fun with that one.
Yeah, that was good.
But thank you so much for taking a chance on letting me interview you and talking about the article. Once
Yeah,
again, it
sure.
was phenomenal. But
Thank you.
thank you so much.
Yeah, no worries, man. Thanks for having me on.
Yes, sir. Hopefully we can do something like this after the draft as well.
Yeah, sure.
Perfect.
I'm probably gonna have a lot of time late May, early June, maybe
Perfect.
even early May. We'll see. So yeah, for sure.
Perfect. Sounds good. Thank you so much.
All right, peace out.
Peace out. Thank you for watching, everybody. I hope you like, comment, and subscribe, all of that. And thank you for watching.